I am super excited to reach the conclusion, the climax, you might say, of the story in Daniel chapter 3, where we have been, I want to say for a good solid month, because we have to keep canceling church and doing things, but we're final and making alterations. But I'm so excited, we're finally reaching the conclusion here of Daniel chapter 3, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So I just want to recap for those who are joining us online, maybe the first time, or those who weren't here. Nebuchadnezzar, who I call Nebu, just so you know, I don't want to say Nebuchadnezzar 1,000 times. I call him Nebu. Nebu built a large idol which represented him, 60 cubits tall, 6 cubits wide, and it represented all the glory of Babylon, and he demanded that everybody come and worship before this idol. But some Babylonian accusers, some Chaldean accusers came and they told on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that they weren't bowing to this idol every time all these instruments started playing. And so last week we read that they go up to Nebu and they tell the king, and the king's like, "You got one last chance, you better bow or else." And we heard them say, even if he doesn't save us from the fire, we would never bow before the idols of Babylon. And so I've put it this way today: we'd rather burn than bow. And that's where we pick up on the story, the last section. It's a fairly good amount of reading, so I want to go ahead and jump straight to it. Daniel chapter 3, 19 through 30. Let's read how the rest of the story plays out. Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" And they answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted him. They disobeyed the king's commands and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's the word of the Lord this morning. What an amazing story, full of so many different details that one could expound upon endlessly almost. But I won't do that to you again this morning. I want to remind you of one thing in particular. I saw this week somebody put on the internet what I was going to be introduced here. It came from John Calvin. John Calvin is one of the most prolific, most important reformers of the 16th century. I mean, he's right after Martin Luther in importance. Martin Luther and John Calvin are some of the most prolific reform. Doesn't mean you have to disagree with them. They were extremely influential. But he said something that I think is right on the mark. It reminds us, he says, God could have saved these people from even the accusers of these Babylonian men. He could have saved them from even having to go in the fire. He could have used the same winds which he spread across the land for creation or parted the Red Sea, but he didn't choose to do that. Instead, God chose to save them in the fire. Why? We'd all rather not to have to go in the fire, right? It's a lot better not to have to suffer, not to have to go through things. But here, God saves them in the fire. Right now, anxiety rises that our beliefs are going to be canceled for not accepting the new cultural narratives. Yeah, I'm jumping straight to it. Many of you feel pushed to extreme tribes. I know this, because they seem to promise more power against the other group's darknesses. Daily news poses issue and after issue in either black or white. You're for me or against me. You're dark and light. And to state it to the extreme, a few of you may even feel like you're Poland in the 1930s, Poland to the country in the 1930s, stuck trying to figure out whether to go with Stalin or Hitler. That's to state it extremely. But sometimes we're pressed between two sides that we know are evil or dark, or there's just the method they use is evil or dark. But there come times in families, in churches, in schools, in jobs, and in nations where there seems no path to actually properly following Jesus. In our story today, if anyone were allies of the king through the book of Daniel, so far as we've read it, it was these three Jewish men. You read this and you have to remember, they so far have been allies to King Nebuchadnezzar. They had been raised up to these high positions of favor. They had supported him so far. Also, the accusers of these Jewish men, they're not necessarily, we read it as though they're allies of the king sometimes. Don't read it as though they're allies of the king. Because if you go back and you look earlier in the text and you look at when they make their accusation, they go to King Nebuchadnezzar and they say, look, if you don't do this, you're going to look like a bad king. So they say, you promised that if somebody didn't do this, they were going to face the fiery furnace. Now, are you? So they put Nebuchadnezzar's kingship on the line. They put his honor on the line, saying, you better follow through with your word, or you're going to look like a weak king. Shouldn't think of them necessarily here as allies. So the fact that they've done this, that they denied bowing, even though Nebu had honored them. Imagine this. Put it this way. Why was he so mad? It's not just that they didn't bow. It's that he had promoted them. And so he is enraged that they are going to put him in this position, most likely. I mean, we're a little presumptive here, but a little bit going, okay, can you imagine lifting somebody up and then they turn and put you in awkward positions? That's infuriating. But these three men had the clarity about God's will and power not to take sides, but to step into the fire. They knew taking side of either side would end in catastrophe for their people. I want to share with you two critical points of understanding if we're going to make the hard choice of going through the fire. And then I want to talk about, lastly, what it means following God today. The first critical point is this. God uses the furnace to free us from bondage and forge a new identity. That's why that's God saving us in the fire rather than from it. You get that? God uses the furnace to free us from bondage and forge a new identity. So if you have your Bibles open still, it's always a good idea. You can look at verses 20, 21, 23, and 24 and see that every time Nebuchadnezzar or anybody's talking about these men before the fire, they are bound up. the writer Nebuchadnezzar keeps emphasizing that they are bound up, tied up, can't control themselves. They're bound. And then you see in verse 25, the very moment Nebuchadnezzar looks in, before he says anything about them walking around, before he says anything about there being a fourth man in the fire, what does he say? They are loosed. They are free in the fire, walking around. It's an amazing thing to think about. See, the fiery furnace actually has a history long before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped in. The Old Testament calls Israel's Exodus story as their deliverance from the iron furnace. Well, what happened then, you have to ask? It was there in Egypt, that Israel was formed into a people, freed then to serve God. That happened in there. The fiery furnace story offers hope now for those who are in exile. The ropes are burned off while they're in exile. They're going to find out who they are as a people while they are in exile. They're going to find that their only hope is in God while they're in exile. In fact, you would notice that people ask me all the time, when did they go from calling themselves Israel to calling themselves Jewish? They did that in the exile. They were forming an identity that was trying to, when they come out of exile, God's point in this is that going into exile, they are full of sin. In exile, they are freed from all those sins in the fire. And when they come out on the other side of exile, they're free to serve God more obediently than ever before. You see how that works? So if you hear this real story from happening to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you go, you understand it. It makes sense that God is going to free us in exile and free us then from exile. Do you see that? Does it make some sense? I hope it makes some sense. That if you're an Israelite, you hear that what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is going to happen to you. It's an amazing story. Because people's hearts are starting to yearn for God to come and rescue them again. God saves them in the fire because it is in the fire, suffering faithfully, that we discover that we can be freed from the world, freed from our sins, and welcomed into His glorious kingdom. Now, here's the thing. God does not want you to suffer. God doesn't want His people to suffer. It's only in the pain, though, if you are letting go of the kingdoms of this world, if you're letting go of idols in your life, and everyone else is bowing to these other idols, you're going to suffer. It's more of a fact of life than a fact that God wants you to suffer. He doesn't want us to have to suffer to be free. Right? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. But the fact is, the world doesn't like God, and if you follow God, you're going to suffer. It's only in the pain of letting go of your dreams and your desires that you're going to find His greater kingdom, His greater dreams, His greater desires for us to flourish. In other words, if these men decide not to go into the fire, even though their hands won't be bound, their lives will still be bound. Do you see that? They're still going to be bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar. Their lives, their law, they're giving over everything. What are we tied down to? What are you tied down to in this world that keeps you bound, that you need to be free from? I find in myself and in most people that we would actually rather dance around fires than enter into the fiery obedience and faithfulness of God. Part of what Israel would rather have done when they were coming out of Egypt is they would rather, remember all this? If you're familiar with the Exodus story, what did they want to do? They wanted to go back to Egypt and just deal with it. They didn't want to walk through the fire. They would rather wander in the wilderness of their lives than enter the promised land with all the battles that it would require. Because they were scared of walking into the fire. We would rather hold a grudge that erodes our character for years than take the moments, minutes, maybe hours, or maybe it might take a while for the healing that could happen through forgiveness and reconciliation. We'd rather dance around keeping the fire away than believing that God works in the fire. Leadership specialist Edwin Friedman wrote in his book, A Failure of Nerve, he anticipated, I'd say with near prophetic accuracy, the growing trend in people's inability to face the fire. He said this, whether we are considering a toothache, a tumor, a relational bind, a technical problem, crime, or the economy, most individuals and most social systems, irrespective of their culture, their gender, or their ethnic background, will naturally choose or revert to chronic conditions of bearable pain rather than face the temporarily more intense anguish of acute conditions, he's a therapist, that are the gateway to becoming free. We do almost anything. It's just like it's a universal problem that we would rather do everything to dance around the fire rather than face that intensity that would really set us free. This is not coming from even a biblical person. This is someone who sees that our society is living that way. That's who we are becoming. And that's why in so many ways you see a spiral down in leadership quality. Not just like politics. We're talking across the board. Where are you all tied up, though? Where are you tied up? What's your driving anxiety? God's healing and freedom aren't found in bitterness. They're not found in violence, isolation, worldly power, or self-preservation, but in the fire of obedience. You see, following God can free you from anxieties the world threatens. He can free you from your fears and even from the sin you do because your heart is so tied to this world. And you have to step into Jesus. You have to step into who He is and what He asks of you in obedience. You have to step toward the cross if you want to be free. This isn't following the cross and accepting the cross. Going to heaven is this great, amazing thing. But you don't have to wait to go to heaven to be free. When you follow Jesus Christ, when you follow Him and you take up your cross, you can begin to live free today. Even in suffering, even in trials, God is the Lord of the fire. That's the second point you got to know. God, our God, Yahweh, is Lord of even the fire. People like Nebu create fires so everyone else has to dance around them. You know people like that, don't you? I hope. People who create fires around themselves to manipulate people, to get them to do what they want, to constantly threaten to explode and go nuts and try to destroy you if you don't do what they say. Nebu is one of these people. They create fires. This is not healthy boundaries for relationships. That's one thing. You can't say everybody who creates a little boundary for you is creating a fire you're trying to dance around. We're talking about people who, if they don't get their way, you're going to be destroyed. Because here's the point. We want to own the fire. We want to control the fire. Nebu thought he controlled the fire, didn't he? Build it up 7 times hotter. Throw them in, and he expected that fire to do exactly what he thought it would do. Ironically, those soldiers who were being obedient to the wrong king pick up the men, throw them in, and Nebu's own men do what? They die. That's irony. Because the three men who were supposed to die, most famously, he peers in and they're walking around. And what does he see? 4 men walking around in the fire. Now, before we jump to the theology of all of this, just think about being Nebuchadnezzar. Wouldn't that be weird? But wouldn't, beyond that, you go, I'm not in charge of this fire. I'm not in charge of this fire. That's a shocker. People never imagine that God is in charge of the fire into which they condemn others. You're not in charge of the fire. I'm not in charge of the fire. The world out there threatening Christians, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or here, ultimately, finally, they are not in charge of the fire. Nebu must have had the shock of his life. One, it says more technically, one like a son of the gods. Now, our God, when we find out about this, the first thing that comes to my mind is this. Our God doesn't stay up in some utopian heaven, right? He comes down not to just walk beside us in the easy times, but he walks with us in the fire, the hardest and most difficult places of our lives. And this moment foreshadows, this is like we call a penultimate miracle or a penultimate event. Penultimate means second to greatest. And it points to the ultimate demonstration of this, right? Does that make sense? There's an ultimate demonstration of God being in the fire for us. And it foreshadows when Rome would make the same mistake thinking that they owned death, that they could end and keep power, they could end someone else's life, that they could keep power by just putting people to death that didn't like it. They thought they were in control. They owned death. If you know anything about Rome, they really did use it as kind of their central tool to keep power in the empire. Now, I want to draw out some parallels for you. I know I don't have a lot of illustrations in the sermon, but the story itself is so full that follow this. The Babylonian accusers used Nebuchadnezzar's proclamation against the 3 men to hold Nebu accountable to the king. We've talked about that. This is basically what Satan has done to us. He has gone and said, I accuse these people of sin. He goes to God in multiple different ways and facets in the text and different ways and says, they're sinful and they're worthy to be condemned. And the difference is we're actually guilty. The other difference is Nebuchadnezzar's not our Lord. What did our God do? Well, he didn't throw us into the fire. Because to be honest, to be a just God, this is what the accuser, I don't want to skip this part. The accuser, Satan, said to God, if you're going to be a just God, then they must burn. Our God's a little more, has a little ground to give. Because he knows there's one thing he can do to still be a just God. And that's to put himself in the fire. That he steps in Jesus Christ, God with us, comes down, steps into this world, and steps into death for us, and takes it on. Do you see this? And he takes it on so that the moment you step into the furnace, any furnace in your life, including death, he has the victory over it. That though you can walk into death when you're following Jesus and walk out the other side. Isn't that amazing? That tells you how wonderful a king that we have. He satisfied his own justice. And again, when you follow Jesus, into the fires, into the sufferings, not just the ultimate one at the end of our lives, but when you follow him all the way through, you're going to find that you're free, that he is burning you and unbinding you from your sin. He's tearing you away from this world, and he's and making you a new creature. Isn't that an amazing thing God has done for us? So when we encounter trials, when we encounter sufferings, which I'd call our penultimate sufferings, right? It's not death. We encounter those. People were complaining. People have always complained about this, right? But 1 Peter, to me, he gets a little tired of the complaints when I read this. But he says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery," see, he's kind of alluding to this. "Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Suffering and obedience is part of God freeing us from this world. But now I will say this. Here's a warning. Not all suffering is liberating. Not even in the end. If you're not following Jesus, if you're not having faith and you're stepping into suffering, there is no promise of redemption. There's no end goal to your suffering, no maturity, and ultimately no hope. Which king are you really following? The question you need to know is if when you're suffering in your life, when suffering comes in your life, is it because you're being obedient to God or just because you're at war with somebody else who's being worldly? I mean, there's other reasons we suffer, right? There's different health things that we suffer, but we can all decide whether or not we're taking those as well to the Lord and asking him to walk with us, or we're going to decide he's not really God or he's not good. Are you walking in the fire of suffering and prepared to walk in the fire of suffering for God? Because most people right now I know are suffering. They're going through some tragedy. They're going through some darkness. They're having trouble with family. They're having trouble with disease or health or something. Are you going into those situations following Jesus? Because this is really important. You can have the right idea that Jesus is real, that God is real, and all these great things, but but not actually even follow him. You can say God's great and God's good. See what Nebuchadnezzar did? He said, "Oh my goodness, this is a wonderful God that you serve. He saved you from this instance," is what he says. But you know what he always says? Their God. You ever notice that? Read the text again. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. He never calls God my God. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't convert here. He's not changing his life. He might be awestruck that these men weren't burned up. But this is what tyrants do, right? They find some truth, and then they tyrannize everyone else with that truth. They take their truth and they say, anyone who argues with this, and I'm going to destroy their families, I'm going to burn down their homes. Now you have to understand, this is a absolute false discipleship that Nebuchadnezzar is offering. Now, in a sense, it does go ahead and protect the Israelite people. That's the good part, right? But it's not discipleship. He's showing you the opposite. They're showing you that a tyrant is going to stay a tyrant if they're opposed to God. There's a philosopher. His name is Karl Popper. And he says this. I think this is interesting. And this is what he thinks all people would do. Now, we're going to argue against that. But he says that if anyone believes that their God is the God, their truth is the truth, and their faith is the faith, that will almost have to lead to totalitarian behavior, like every time. And that makes some sense, right? That's why Christians today are scared of the world's new narratives and truths. Because we know that once they think they have the truth, that they're going to tyrannize everybody else to follow this guideline or this doctrine, which right now is something called tolerance, but not exactly, right? It's kind of funny, tolerance becomes totalitarian. What is it? Yes. Thank you, intolerance. But it's also why people are scared of Christianity. Because there is a lot of Christian history, and I'd say a lot of Christians today who once they think they have the truth of Jesus, that they can then go around and tyrannize other people with it. So what are we to do? Is this a false representation? I would think so. Maybe people say, then we need to have no truth at all. That's the other narrative. That's part of the tolerance thing. Have no truth at all. All religions go to heaven. Anything other than that is to be intolerant, like he said, and a totalitarian people. That's the argument we're facing. That's the ultimate doctrine of the new modern American faith. No absolute truth is the ultimate truth. And that's pretty intolerant. Well, we believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? People are scandalized by the fact that we say Jesus is the only way. So how should we act when we believe this? Should we act totalitarian? See, Jesus on the cross is what makes Christianity able to claim ultimate truth without declaring everyone must bow down or be destroyed. You can't have a Lord who goes and suffers and bleeds and dies and loves and cares. When love, that kind of love and sacrifice is your ultimate truth, it should never be totalitarian. So what do we do? How do we thrive in this world today? John 3:17, just after the famous John 3:16. John 3:17 says this, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." That's an amazing thing. God himself, when he came here, did not come he didn't come to beat people down to follow him. He came to free them. He came to bust open the chains of our life and sin. Now, people, they will stand condemned on their own, by their own sins. But he didn't come to beat people down. He didn't come to be a totalitarian that says, you do it my way or you're going to burn right now. People are burning themselves anyway. He forms us into obedience through love and not the power of fear. You see, these three men, they didn't go around looking for trouble. They had to be told on. Somebody had to go tell on them that they were not doing what they were supposed to do. They didn't start a riot. They didn't start a protest with signs all over the place saying, I'm not going to bow to the idol. They didn't do any of those things. I'm not saying those things are necessarily wrong, but they didn't, well, some of it is, but protesting, they didn't have to do that. They lived the truth. And they did it boldly enough that everybody knew that when this word came down, that those men wouldn't bow. If you want to defend God, his ways, his character, and his love, you're going to have to walk into the fire rather than destroying and sending other people into the fire. Jesus would want us to love people to conversion, not condemn them to non-conversion. Does that make sense? He wants you to love people, not go around saying everyone who doesn't follow me or do what I say. Living it out is much more powerful. Now, there's times you got to talk about things, right? Abortion, different things we need to talk about. But living it out is much more powerful than all your social media words. But mostly just bounce around to your own friend groups. Are you living out what it means to follow Jesus as the truth, the one who walks through the fire because they love? Or are you more likely to be Nebuchadnezzar, trying to throw everybody who disagrees with you into a fire? If someone were to look into your life, into your world of suffering, would they see the Lord? Would they see him in there with you in your suffering? Would you be trying to pull everybody else in? I want you to be ready for whatever suffering that obedience or life happens to bring to you, so that when the world sees you in the fiery furnace, they will see also the Son of God. Are you ready? I want people to see you breaking free, loosed from this world, even when you suffer. That God rules even over the fire, and he rules over real freedom. If you feel like you're being consumed right now by the fire and the suffering of your life, I want you to invite Jesus, ask Jesus to come into that suffering with you. I want you to say, Lord, I need you where I'm at right now. If you've never accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and you need to invite him into that suffering for the first time, I invite you to do that. Maybe you followed Jesus a long time and you're in the fires and you just haven't even gotten to that point. Maybe I don't know where your heart is, but is Jesus in there with you? I invite you to come this morning, pray with me, come to the altar, pray where you're at, as we're going to be taking just a few minutes at the end of this service, that I want you to invite Jesus more deeply into your interactions with this world, your suffering, and your trials.